Welcome back to the Scotti-BYTE channel, and this is Scott. Well, it's been a few days since my last tutorial, and today I thought I would discuss VPS and LXD. So virtual private servers provide the end user with only one IP address. When I talk about virtual private servers, I'm referring to something like AWS, Azure, or any of the other public service providers that will allow you to have a server instance out on the web in order to provide your hosted applications. So I encourage the use of LXD containers that are bridged to your home network LAN, with each one getting a unique IP address from your router. And this is still my recommended best practice. But that being said, I think we do need to discuss VPS. So we're going to discuss using NginX Proxy Manager, LXD Dashboard, and LXD containers to provide a full hosting environment inside of one host that can be used for a VPS implementation on one VPS instance. And that's pretty exciting. This can also be used for a hosting environment that may be easily moved from one site to another. And one of my users by the name of Eric was searching for an enclave solution that looks exactly like that. This diagram is entitled LXD for a self-hosted environment for VPS or for portable hosting. On your typical network, and what I've discussed so far in the channel, we have a router, we have a LAN network, we have NginX Proxy Manager, and NginX Proxy Manager looks for input coming from the wide area network, and it looks for subdomain names, for example, www.scotti-byte.com or chat.scotti-byte.com or discussion.scotti-byte.com, and routes it to the appropriate server instance in order to provide that particular service. And the way we do that is through NginX Proxy Manager, which is a reverse proxy solution. LXD containers are bridged through bridge 0 on the LXD host. So even though this looks like 4 different server instances, in reality, it's really one host with 4 LXD instances on it. And LXD containers, because they're bridged, are providing unique IP addresses out on your main LAN, so you can have that single LXD host with many TCP/IP addresses. So what I'm talking about here, or what I'm proposing, is that we have either a WAN or a LAN connection down here. We would have a WAN connection in the case of a virtual private server, or we would have a LAN connection in the case of perhaps a portable hosting environment, or what we might consider to be a portable enclave. And what this is this is a VPS solution with NginX Proxy Manager. So LXD containers would be bridged via the LXDWare device that gets created when you do a LXD init. And therefore the containers would be on internal NAT addresses inside of the private LXD network that gets created. And so therefore you would have one single host. That would be the LXD host, would have its own single TCP/IP address. And this VPS solution can be used as a portable self-hosting solution inside of a single virtual machine, or perhaps inside of a physical machine. For the purposes of this tutorial, what I have here is a virtual machine, but certainly this would work with a VPS, and it would also work with a physical machine. So if I do an if config to take a look at my network configuration, you can see we have a very simple network configuration. I have an address on my mainland in this particular case. If you were on a VPS, this address would effectively be a WAN address because the VPS would be located on the public internet. And then I just have a loopback connector here. So in order to do this, the first step we're going to do is a sudo snap install of LXD to make sure that LXD is installed on the system. It probably is on the service instance, and you can see that this server instance does have LXD installed. So my next step is going to be a sudo LXD init, as I've done many times on the channel before, and the init command is required in order to set up a LXD instance. So would you like to use clustering? My answer is going to be no. Do you want to configure a new storage pool? Yes, we do. Name of the new storage pool, default is fine. And then name of the backend storage to use, and it defaults to ZFS, and that would be my favorite. Create a new storage pool. The answer is yes. Would you like to use existing empty block device to establish your ZFS storage pool? No, I do not, in which case it's going to create it inside of a virtual file. And it says the size in gigabytes for the new loop storage device. And I think I'm going to set this one at 50 gigabytes, which is more than enough for my demonstration purposes. And then would you like to connect with a MAS server, Metal as a Service? The answer is no. Would you like to create a new local network bridge? The answer is yes. This is going to create that LXDBR0 device. And what IP address should be used? Auto is fine. What IPv6 address should be used? Again, auto is fine. Would you like the LXD server to be available over the network? The answer is yes, because we want to talk to it with LXD Dashboard. An address to bind LXD to, and the default will be all. Well, it only has one adapter, which is the one that we saw, ENP5S0. And then the port to bind to by default is 8443, and that is fine. That is the default. And then what's the trust password for new clients? I will enter that, even though I'm not going to use that because I'm going to use certificates. Would you like the stale cached images to be updated automatically? And the answer, as always, is yes. And would you like to have the YAML pre-seed printed out? No, I really don't need to see that YAML file as it's generated. And once this completes, we have our LXD prepared and ready to create containers. For convenience, I'm going to add my name to the LXD group with a sudo usermod space -a capital G LXD Scott, followed by a new grp LXD, and followed by a groups command. And you can see that now Scott is in the LXD group. So the purpose of that is so that we don't have to use sudo commands whenever we issue a LXD command. So I can say LXC list, and we get a list, and it says to start your container, try a LXC launch. The first container we're going to create will be one for NginX Proxy Manager. So I have a LXC launch Ubuntu :22.04. NPM will be the name of the container. Boot.autostart is equal to true, which means that every time the LXC host boots, then this container will start. And -c security.nesting equals to true means that we're allowed to nest inside of it. And the reason for that is because NPM is a Docker application, and we want to be able to nest Docker inside of this particular container. Now that the container is started, if I do a LXC list, you can see that the container is up and running, but it has a 10.64.32.35 address, which is an address inside of the LXD NAT network. And for our purposes, that's fine. If you watch the channel normally, you'll see that I usually like to bridge my containers out to the main LAN and have the bridge device. In this case, I've not created the bridge device, but instead I'm going to be happy with having the container running inside of the NAT network. So let's move inside that container with a LXC exec npm bosh. And now we have a console command prompt inside of our new npm container. The next step we're going to do is to install Docker on that container. And we're going to do that with the standard Docker script of curl to the Docker script on the Docker website. Now we're going to install Docker Compose since we're going to need that. Now that we have Docker Compose installed and Docker, we want to go ahead and create myself a username. So I'm going to do an add user, Scott. And I'm going to do a user mod -a, capital G, sudo Scott. And then I'm going to su over to Scott. We'll do a groups command on Scott. And Scott is in the sudo group. So then we're going to do a user mod -a, G, Docker, Scott. We're going to need a sudo in order to do that. We do a new grp Scott, and then we do a groups command, and we can see that Scott is in the Scott group. Okay, so that is not correct. This is great. Live video is wonderful, right? So what we need to do is a new group on Docker, not on Scott. And we do a groups command. And sure enough, Docker is one of the groups that Scott has access to. So let's create a Docker Compose file for NginX Proxy Manager with the nano docker-compose.yml. And then we paste in the YAML file for Docker Compose, which is really pretty simple. And you notice that it uses ports 80 and 81 and 443. So this would normally not be a problem in a dedicated container. And in fact, it would be able to communicate outwards on the mainland if it had a dedicated address. But that's not true in this particular case. So we'll save this off and we'll do a docker-compose up-d. And that will go ahead and pull the container and start it for NginX Proxy Manager. Now that NginX Proxy Manager is up and running, I should be able to do a Docker PS and see that it is running. And sure enough, it says that its status is it has been up for 38 seconds and it was created about a minute ago. So for all intent purposes, it seems to be up and running just fine. So it might be interesting to exit out of this and look at, let's see, we have to exit out again, I suppose. and again, and one more time. And now we're back at the Scott level here on the test environment. So if we do a LXC list, we can see that our NPM is up and running, and it's up and running with Docker, and that there is a 10.65.32.35 address that it is using for that particular container, which is an internal NAT address. Now, I probably don't have to tell you, but if we were to try to reach NginX Proxy Manager by going to that address, port 81, which is normally what we do with NginX Proxy Manager, we're not going to be able to get there. So from the LXD host itself, if we try to do an SSH over to the address of that particular container, and again, we'll remind ourselves what that address is with the LXC list. If we do an SSH over to 10.64.32.35, we are able to reach it because we are on the same network with it being on the LXD host itself. The reason that we got the permission denied here is because when you create most new containers, you're going to need to reinstall the OpenSSH server. So we'll do an apt remove --purge on OpenSSH-server. And we say yes, we want to remove it. Once it is removed, we will turn right back around again and we will install it with a apt install OpenSSH-server. And now it generates a new set of keys. And I should be able to exit back out to the LXD host called test. If I do a LXC list, there it is. And if I do an SSH over to that address, I'm going to get now a host identification has changed. And so what it wants me to do is it wants me to remove this key from the database, which I do. Again, let's go back and list it. Let's go back and connect to it. This time it thinks it's a new fingerprint. I enter my password for the Scott account and it should log in, which it does. So the interesting thing about this is that we could not reach the machine from my web browser, but my web browser was running from my desktop. However, we could reach the machine with SSH, and the reason we could reach it from SSH is because we were on the LXD host. And the LXD host does have access to the LXD containers that are on its NAT network through the LXD BR0 bridge. And we're going to take advantage of that in order to make our NginX Proxy Manager instance available from our network. We're going to want to log off of our NPM instance with an exit command. So we go back to the LXD host, and the LXD host, I'll remind you, is running at the address of 172.16.1.204. And if you notice now, we have more than just the ENP5S0 interface. We have the loopback interface, we have the LXD BR0 interface, and we have this virtual Ethernet interface that is coming from the new LXD container. So in order to allow this to be accessible through our network, we need to create a network port forward for our LXD container. So that being said, when I said LXD port forward, you were probably thinking, well, port forwards are normally used for my router, and you wouldn't be wrong there. But the LXD private NAT network that is bridged by the LXDBR0 device can be looked upon as a router itself. So if we do a LXC network forward create LXD BR0 172.16.1.204, what that is the host that we're communicating with, which means the actual IP address of this device. Again, if we do the if config, we would see that 204 address out there. So we want to actually have 3 ports that we provide access to from the main network. The first one will be port 80. So we say LXC network forward port add to LXDBR0 on 172.16.1.204. The TCP port 80, that is to go down to the container at 10.64.32.35, which is our NPM container, also at port 80. So we've added that port forward, and likewise, we'll add similar port forwards for port 443, and 80 and 443, of course, are used for the web traffic. And then the web interface that we need to communicate with NPM is at port 81. So we'll add a port forward for port 81 as well. Now that we have the port forwards in place for our NATed container, we go back to our web browser, which is on the main LAN, and we access 172.16.1.204 and port 81. The 204 address is the address of the LXD server, and port 81, of course, is being forwarded down to the NPM container. So when I launch that, I get the NginX Proxy Manager. And so in order to set up NginX Proxy Manager, we type in admin@example.com, and the password or initial password is change me, all in lowercase, and that will sign us in. So at this point, I can go ahead and change the full name to maybe Scott, and the nickname I'll leave as admin, and I'll change this to bmsman@gmail.com. And that email is significant because that's what you'll create the containers at, as far as the self-signed certificates from Let's Encrypt. And then it wants you to change your password. The current password is ChangeMe, ChangeMe, and then it wants you to type in a new password. And this should be a complex password, not the short one I'm indicating here. And I do a save, and now I have my NginX Proxy Manager up. If I go to Dashboard, I have 0 proxy host. Now, the beauty of this is that since I have this created, we can create other containers that are internal NAT addresses, and they don't have to have any exposure to the main network as long as all they use are the web ports. Otherwise, we will have to add specific port forwards for them in order to communicate down to those particular ports. So we'll create a couple of other containers, and we'll show that NginX Proxy Manager, since it's running on the NAT network, will be able to reach all of the other containers running on the NAT network, and you'll be able to serve those apps out. So this works on the VPS, because imagine if your VPS was using 172.16.1.204 as its address on the WAN, that would be the only address you were using from that host that is exposed. And so from the VPS perspective, that's your only IP address. All these internal addresses are being managed by a LXD NAT network, and your VPS provider is not aware of those. So basically, NginX Proxy Manager is acting as a traffic cop just as it would on a local area network. So now that we have NginX Proxy Manager running, probably the next container we would like to create would be one for LXD Dashboard. So in order to do that, we'll do a LXC launch Ubuntu 22.04 LXD-Dashboard, and we have the switch boot.autostart equals to true. And you notice that we don't have the nesting switch on this particular one because the LXD Dashboard is a simple web application and it is not a Docker application, as you will see shortly. So let's move inside of our new container with the LXC exec LXD-Dashboard Bosh. And I didn't do this last time, but whenever you create a new container, you should be able to, or you should be doing an apt update in order to update all the repositories, because they're not always completely updated when you have a new container created. And also sometimes there are applications that should be updated as well. And once the repository is updated, sure enough, you can see that there are 34 packages that can be upgraded. So if we do an apt upgrade, it will come back and say, would you like to upgrade those 34 packages? And we say, yes, we would. I should have done that on the NPM container, and I'll probably go back and do that later as a best practice. Now that the LXD instance is upgraded, let's go ahead and install LXD Dashboard. And we start by putting some of the dependencies in here. After the dependencies are installed, the next thing we'll do is a wget to get the package from the GitHub site for the LXD Dashboard source code. And this is a really simple installation because all we end up doing is moving the components into their locations and restarting them, and the NginX web server serves them out. So there's really not a whole lot to the installation of LXD Dashboard. And I have a video elsewhere on the channel entitled LXD Dashboard where I show the installation. I noticed that today that LXD Dashboard has been updated to version 3.7, which is a new version, so you may want to go out and get that new version. And here you can see that I have version 3.7 being downloaded. And now that it's downloaded, the next thing that I do is I untar it. And what I end up with is basically a LXD Dashboard and then a tar gz file. And then I copy them into the places that they're supposed to be. And then I also make a directory for the SQL database data to be stored. I make a data directory for the LXD containers, and I make a backup directory. After I do that, I have to change the ownership of those files to match the web server ownership at www-data. And once I've done that, all I need to do is to restart NginX web server, and the NginX web server is restarted, and we're pretty much done with that. So this app is a little bit different because I probably don't want to serve my LXD dashboard out to the public internet via a subdomain name. So instead, what I really want to do is I really want to have that application presented on the main address, and I want to be able to access it there. So here we are back at our LXD host, and if I do a LXD list, you can see that the NPM container has that internal NAT address of 10.64.32.35, but our brand new LXD dashboard container has a similar address of 10.64.32, but in this case 149. And as I said, I don't want to provide LXD dashboard through NPM like I do with the rest of my applications that I'm going to serve, but LXD dashboard is really just a utility for me. So knowing that, I can't access LXD dashboard as far as its GUI interface from outside the net, or outside the NAT, I should say. So I have to then do a LXD network forward port add LXDBR0, again the host address of 172.16.1.204, which is the host address of the LXD server, and then I say TCP port 8080, that's where I want to expose it, and I said go to the container at 10.64.32.149 and take port 80 and forward that back to port 8080. So now I hit enter on that, and now if I bring up my web browser again, I should be able to grab this address that I used for NPM. I should be able to paste it in here, but instead of port 81, I put port 8080, and this should get to my LXD dashboard. And sure enough, it does bad gateway, which is exactly what we were expecting, because there's one more step that we need to perform in order to actually get it to work under Ubuntu 22.04. To fix this issue with Ubuntu 22.04 and LXD dashboard, I moved back into the container with the LXD exec LXD-dashboard bosh, and once I'm in there, then I go edit the file etc nginx sites-enable default. And when I go in to edit that file, I scroll down and it has a section which says that we want to uncomment the PHP 8.1 and we want to comment the PHP 7.4 because Ubuntu 22.04 uses PHP 8.1. So now I do a Control X, save it, and then I'm going to do a sudo systemctl restart nginx, and once I do that, I should be able to bring my Chrome browser back up and reload the website, and sure enough, we come up with the registration page for LXDWare LXD Dashboard. So I'll give myself a username of Scott, create myself a very simple password, which should not be what you do. You should create a complex password. I'll go ahead and put my email address in here, and my default database will be SQLite, and I say register account. It usually takes a minute or so, and it will come up, and it will ask for my credentials. I type in Scott, and I type in my very complex password, and I log in, and there we are with the dashboard for LXD Dashboard. And as you can see, it's not listing anything yet, and that's because we don't have any hosts listed. In order to get our host added, we have to click on View Certificate, and you want to go ahead and do a Control A. Well, maybe not a Control A. Let's go ahead and just select over the entire certificate, including the begin and end certificate, and go ahead and copy that and then dismiss it. So then we go back over here and we exit out of this machine so that we are back at the LXD host level. And at this host level, we can do a nano on LXDWare.crt, creating a certificate file. And what we want to do is we want to paste the certificate into that file. Go ahead and do a Control X and save the file. And once we have that file saved, then we're going to do the command lexc config trust add LXDWare.crt, and that will add the certificate. And we also want to add a command to trust hosts coming in, and so we do a lexc config set core.https _address to be anything. And what you might want to do, especially if this is out in a VPS, you might want to specify a particular address that is allowed to access your LXD host and not just any address. Now that the certificate is added at the host, I could go back to my instance of LXD Dashboard and say add host, and I'll provide the address 172.16.1.204, which is the IP address of the LXD host, and then it's port 8443, and I can just say something like my host. You might want to name it a little bit better. And I'm not providing any external address or external port. That's something else you might explore. It's beyond the scope of this video. If I do a submit, it should add that in there. And now when I click on that, we see that we have two containers up and running. If I click on them, you can see that I have a LXD dashboard and an NginX Proxy Manager. So now that I have my LXD dashboard running, let's create a container using the GUI as opposed to the command line. So I'm going to make this full screen. I'm going to click on Add a Container. And up here, I'll go ahead and name this container Whiteboard. And I'll give it the description Whiteboard. And then the image I want to use is Ubuntu 2204 LTS, which is what I've been using all along. We're going to use the default profile. I can go out here and set limits and that sort of thing, but I'm going to come over here to security, and I'm going to set nesting equal to true because we are going to nest Docker inside of this particular container. And then I'm going to do an OK, and it will begin to create my whiteboard container. So now it's created my whiteboard container. I can go ahead and click Start in order to start it, and it should start up here shortly. You can see at the top in red where it says Starting Container, and then the starting container went out, and it says it's running, and it got another address on the internal NAT of 10.64.32.83. So let's go ahead and click on that, and let's go into the exec, and let's go ahead and say Start Exec, and it asks you to visit this particular website to accept the signed certificate. We do an advanced, and we say Proceed. At this point, we can close that tab in the web browser, and we can dismiss this here, and now we can say Start Exec, and there we have a console prompt, just as though we did a lexc exec on the whiteboard container into the Bash shell. So I'm going to do my apt update from here. Runs that. updates all the repositories. And then the next step I'll do after that is an apt upgrade. And I say, yes, I want to take all of the upgrades. Now that the updates are installed, I'm going to do like I did before with the NPM container, and I'm going to install Docker with the curl command. And I'm going to install Docker Compose with the sudo apt install docker-compose. Now it's noteworthy that I really don't need to provide the sudo command here because I'm running as root in the exec shell. I could have created a user account, and I generally consider it a best practice to go ahead and create a user account, but just for brevity here, I'm going to just go ahead and install this directly. So now we have Docker installed. We should be able to do a Docker PS, and sure enough, it comes back. If we were running as a user, we would need to add ourselves to the Docker group. Otherwise, we would use the sudo command every time we would issue a Docker command. So rather than creating a Docker Compose file, so I guess I didn't really need to install Docker Compose, I'm just going to use a simple Docker run. And this is Docker run space -d to detach --name equals whiteboard -port expose port 80, and it should be port 8080 here inside of the container. And then there's the name of the container on Docker Hub. So now it goes ahead and downloads that image for the whiteboard, and it starts it. And keep in mind, it's going to be running on that internal NAT address at port 80. And so I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, well, wait a minute, aren't we using port 80 on the LXD host? And it's true that we are, but we're going to serve this application out on NginX Proxy Manager, so we can really use any port that we want because that will be available. So here we go. It's starting, and it is started. So if I do a Docker PS command, you should see that whiteboard is up and running, and it is. But it's not reachable yet, and we're going to have to serve it out through NginX Proxy Manager, and that's next. Here we are over at my domain name service provider, which in my case happens to be Google Domains. I go down to custom records in the DNS section, and I'm going to enter the type as an A record, and the A record that I'm going to have is going to point to the address 76.143.144.78. Now, in your particular case, if you were using a VPN, or VPS rather, your VPS host would be the address that you'd want to put here. That would also be, obviously, the host for your LXD server. It's your VPS instance. So I do a save, and they usually grant you static addresses so you can set it up as an A record and not have to worry about dynamic DNS like we would if we were on a local network for an ISP. And then I'm going to go in here and say manage custom records, create myself a new record, and I'm going to create a record called whiteboard, and that's going to be a CNAME record, which is simply an alias to point to Scotti-BYTE.net. So now I have a CNAME record and a record, and that should be all we need. We can close that, and we can go back over here to NginX Proxy Manager and add a proxy host. So the proxy host we want to add is whiteboard.scotti-byte.net. And then we want to indicate the IP address for this particular service, and that IP address is going to be the IP address of the NAT address for the whiteboard instance. So we copy that and we go back up to NginX Proxy Manager and we paste that address in here. And the forward port is going to be port 80. Now recall that inside the Docker container it was using 8080, but we told it to forward back to port 80. And since 10.64.32.83 isn't using anything else at port 80, we were able to do that. So then I do block common exploits, WebSocket support. I go over to SSL and I choose request a new certificate. I say I agree to Let's Encrypt Terms of Service and I click Save, and it should go out and create the new proxy as well as the new SSL certificate without any errors. And it did that. So the next thing you want to do is go back and edit this, come over to the SSL tab, click on Force SSL, and usually I like to also engage HTTP 2 support and do a save. Now that we have that, if I go over and open a new tab on my browser, or really anywhere on the internet, I should be able to go to whiteboard.scotti-BYTE.net, and sure enough, it goes to the whiteboard application, and we've hosted our first app. If we go back to LXD Dashboard and go to containers, you can see that we have LXD Dashboard out there. We have NginX Proxy Manager, which is doing the heavy lifting, serving Whiteboard out there, and Whiteboard would be our first app. So we could create many other apps on internal addresses and they would all work fine. And these addresses out here will always come out to be the same addresses once they're granted on the container, so they don't change, so there's no management to be done on your router, which is one of the reasons why I said that this might be a good application for an enclave. If this LXD host is a virtual machine, you could pick up that virtual machine and drop it on any other system and launch it. The only real difference that you would have is you would have to go back and change the address of your DNS to point correctly because of that. And you may also have to go make updates to our network port forwards if the address of the actual LXD host changes. So in summary, a LXD environment can be implemented inside of a single virtual private server host. NginX Proxy Manager can manage access to LXD containers on the same VPS host because the host can communicate with the LXD NAT network via LXDWare. Normally, LXD NAT containers cannot be externally accessed unless they're being accessed from the LXD host itself. This tutorial shows a means to use NginX Proxy Manager and LXD Dashboard to enable a hosting environment inside one VPS host. Anyway, that's it for today. Please subscribe and like to the channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell, and we'll see you next time.